Why, after conquering death, did Jesus not begin with a grand speech, gather crowds, and perform an impressive miracle before everyone? Why did the resurrected Jesus choose something so simple, so common, almost banal, like preparing breakfast for the disciples? This is a question that almost no one asks when thinking about the resurrection, but perhaps it is one of the most important questions for anyone who truly wants to understand the heart of Jesus. When we talk about the resurrection, our minds usually go straight to power, glory, triumph, and absolute victory. We think of the empty tomb, the angels, the removed stone, the historical and spiritual impact of this event. All of that is true, but there's a detail right after that that goes unnoticed by many people. A silent, intimate post-resurrection moment, away from the crowds, where Jesus doesn't preach, doesn't explain profound doctrines, and doesn't demand anything from anyone. He simply prepares a meal, and it is precisely there that something profound happens. Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever lived through a moment when you expected something grand from God? A clear answer, a strong sign, but all you found was silence and simple gestures? Often, we associate God's presence only with big events, big answers, and major turning points. But what if, in many moments, God is acting precisely in a discreet way, in everyday life, when no one is applauding? What you are about to discover may surprise you. After the resurrection, the disciples were still confused, tired, and emotionally broken. Despite Jesus having conquered death, they still carried fear, frustration, guilt, and uncertainty. And it is in this context that Jesus appears. He doesn't arrive demanding faith. He doesn't begin with a sermon about the resurrection. He doesn't point out past mistakes. Jesus remains silent, lights the fire, prepares the fish, and invites the disciples to eat. Jesus' actions speak louder than any discourse at that moment. This often forgotten episode reveals something powerful about who Jesus is and how he acts when no one is watching. Jesus knows the human heart. Jesus knows that, before any mission, before any calling, those people needed to be cared for. They needed to be restored emotionally. They needed to feel, again, that they were still loved, accepted, and welcome at the table. Jesus did this not by chance. Jesus knew exactly what he was doing, and Jesus allowed that simple moment to become a space of profound healing. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this gesture completely changes how we see spirituality and how God manifests himself in our daily lives. Often, what transforms us is not the extraordinary, but the ordinary. It's not the noise, but the silence. It's not the rush, but the presence. Jesus' actions at that breakfast reveal a hidden teaching that remains extremely relevant for those who live their faith amidst routine, fatigue, and emotional wounds. Perhaps you are expecting God to speak in a specific way, while he is trying to reach you in another. Perhaps you are seeking complex answers, when Jesus is offering simple care. This post-resurrection moment invites us to look more closely at small gestures, silent encounters, and what seems too common to be spiritual. And it is precisely from this seemingly insignificant detail that we begin to perceive something much greater, something that will reveal itself step by step as we move forward in this story. As we journey through this silent and profound moment in history, I want to invite you not to remain merely a spectator, because this episode isn't just about what Jesus did that day. It speaks directly to what many of us are experiencing right now. Perhaps you too are going through a phase of weariness, confusion, or waiting, and this simple gesture of Jesus has touched something deep within you. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you most so far, or if you have ever experienced a moment where you felt God caring for you in a simple, almost discreet, yet profoundly real way. Your story can help others who are going through something similar and haven't yet been able to see it. If this content resonates with you, liking this video is a simple way to show that this type of message matters. It's not just a click. It's a sign that conversations like this need to continue happening and reaching more people who might need exactly this message today. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, which speaks of faith, Jesus, and the presence of God in real, everyday life. And if you feel you want to continue reflecting on these gestures, these silences, and these attitudes of Jesus that almost never receive attention, subscribing to the channel is a way to walk together. Here, the idea is to create a community of people who are not just looking for quick answers, but are willing to look more deeply at the Bible and at how Jesus acts when no one is watching. Stick around, walk with me, because this breakfast prepared by Jesus still has much to teach us, and the next part of the story begins exactly where many usually pass right by. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because to understand the power of Jesus' gesture, we need to go back in time a little and enter the real emotional state of those disciples. Not the idealized version that we often create, but the raw reality of what they were experiencing. The resurrection had already happened, the tomb was empty, some appearances had already occurred, but that doesn't mean their hearts were at peace. Quite the contrary. Their minds were still confused, their emotions were in disarray, and the feeling of failure was difficult to ignore. Think about it, these men had left everything to follow Jesus. Personal plans, security, routine, identity. They believed they were walking towards something great, towards a kingdom that would change everything. And then came the crucifixion. The imprisonment, the unjust trial, the violence, the public death. All of this didn't just destroy a leader. It profoundly shook their mentality, their confidence in their own decisions, and even their understanding of God. The resurrection brought hope, yes, but it didn't automatically erase the trauma. There's a huge difference between knowing something in your head and being able to process it in your heart. Some disciples were overcome by fear, others by guilt. Peter, for example, carried the weight of having denied Jesus at the most critical moment. Others had fled, hidden, done exactly what they promised they would never do. There is a silent pain when we realize we have failed precisely when we most wanted to do right. And this pain doesn't disappear just because something extraordinary happened afterward. It remains there, working inside, affecting decisions, vision of the future, and even how a person sees themselves. Therefore, when the biblical text shows the disciples returning to fishing, it's not just a detail of the setting. It's almost an emotional reflection. Returning to what was known, to what seemed safe, to what gave them some sense of control. Fishing wasn't just work, it was refuge. It was the place where they didn't have to directly deal with difficult questions about calling, mission, or purpose. It was as if, even after the resurrection, they were still trying to understand what to do with everything they had experienced. Their journey was far from over. It is in this emotional backdrop that Jesus appears. And that changes everything. Because Jesus doesn't arrive ignoring this context. He doesn't force an instant transformation, doesn't demand perfect faith, doesn't require ready-made answers. He respects the process. Jesus knows the hidden truth behind their actions. He knows that that fruitless night fishing wasn't just about fish, but about frustration, exhaustion, and an attempt to move forward without knowing exactly where to go. This detail is crucial because it reveals something very profound about how Jesus relates to wounded people. He doesn't address the mission first, he addresses the heart. He doesn't begin by talking about the future while the past is still bleeding. There is a silent wisdom in Jesus' actions, an accurate reading of the emotional impact that recent events had on the lives of those men. Jesus understands that before any important decision, before any resumption of purpose, something needs to be restored from within. And perhaps it is precisely here that this story begins to touch our own journey. How many times do we move forward on the outside, but inside we are still dealing with old frustrations, unresolved guilt, and fears that no one sees? How many times does life go on, but the mind is trapped in unanswered questions? True transformation doesn't happen when we ignore these inner layers, but when they are embraced, understood, and cared for. And Jesus demonstrates this in a practical, simple, and profoundly human way. This post-resurrection moment shows that Jesus' spirituality is not disconnected from emotional reality. On the contrary, he enters precisely into the space where faith and emotion meet, where hope is still fragile, where trust needs to be carefully rebuilt. There is no rush, no demands. There is presence. There is sensitivity. There is a clear understanding that great revelations only make sense when the heart is ready to receive them. All of this sets the stage for understanding why that breakfast was so necessary and so powerful. It wasn't just a meal. It was an environment of restoration. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a direct response to the disciples' emotional state. Every detail carries impact. Every silence communicates something. Every action of Jesus reveals a mindset completely different from our common logic. And the more we observe this forgotten context, the more we realize that nothing there was by chance. If, while you're listening to this, something inside you starts to make sense, write in the comments, This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is here that Jesus' gesture begins to reveal layers that normally go unnoticed when we read the text in haste. Faced with tired, frustrated, and emotionally wounded men, Jesus does not do what many of us would expect. He doesn't gather everyone for a detailed explanation of the resurrection. He doesn't start with difficult questions. He doesn't confront failures, doesn't demand positions, doesn't require immediate decisions. Jesus simply bends down, lights the fire, prepares the fish, and organizes breakfast. It is such a simple gesture that, precisely for that reason, it carries a profound impact. Jesus' silence at that moment is not empty. It is intentional. There is a hidden truth in that silence that speaks louder than any discourse. In a world that values quick answers, strong arguments, and complete explanations, Jesus chooses another path. He understands that those people did not need more information at that moment. They needed care. They needed to feel safe. They needed to realize that there was still room at the table, even after everything that had happened. The impact of this gesture is not in what Jesus says, but in what he does. When Jesus cooks, he places himself in a position that breaks expectations. The Master serves. The resurrected one cares. He who conquered death assumes an everyday, almost domestic attitude. This shakes the mindset of the observer because it redefines what power, authority, and spirituality mean. Jesus does not use the resurrection to distance himself, but to draw closer. He does not impose himself, he offers himself. And this reveals a profound transformation in how we understand the presence of God in real life. It's important to understand that Jesus doesn't ignore past mistakes, but neither does he begin with them. Care comes before correction. Presence comes before words. There's a silent pedagogy in Jesus' actions that teaches without humiliating, corrects without hurting, and restores without exposing. He creates an environment where the heart can relax, where emotional defenses can lower, where trust begins to be rebuilt from the inside out. This is a principle that runs throughout the spiritual journey and directly impacts how we deal with people and with ourselves. How many times do we try to solve everything with words when, in reality, what's lacking is presence? How many decisions are made without considering the emotional state involved? Jesus shows that real transformation doesn't begin with pressure, but with acceptance. He understands that, for there to be a change in mindset, there must first be emotional security. And this security doesn't come from long speeches, but from simple, repeated, and sincere gestures. The breakfast prepared by Jesus serves as a transitional space. It is not yet the moment of public restoration, nor of a clear resumption of the mission, but it is also no longer the chaos of the crucifixion. It is an interval full of meaning, a silent backdrop where something is being rebuilt without fanfare. While the fish roasts, something happens within the disciples. While the bread is broken, a truth is absorbed. They still belong, they are still seen, they are still cared for. This type of gesture reveals a deeply embodied spirituality, connected to the reality of life. Jesus does not superficially spiritualize pain, nor does he ignore the emotional impact of loss. He enters this space with respect, patience, and intention. Every movement carries meaning. Every silence communicates something. Nothing there is random. There is a practical wisdom that teaches us that not every revelation comes in the form of words, and not every correction needs to be spoken aloud. Perhaps that's why this moment is so rarely remembered. It doesn't impress at first glance. It doesn't draw attention for the extraordinary, but for the ordinary. And yet, it carries profound revelations about how God works behind the scenes of our history. Often, while we wait for a direct answer, Jesus is preparing an environment. While we want explanations, he is offering care. While we seek immediate clarity, he is working on something deeper, more lasting. This silent gesture also confronts us, because it forces us to reconsider our own attitudes. How do we deal with wounded people? Do we start by demanding, explaining, correcting? Or do we create space, presence, and care? Jesus shows us that true impact doesn't come from haste, but from sensitivity. It doesn't come from control, but from surrender. It doesn't come from the need to solve everything, but from the willingness to walk alongside them. As the scene progresses, it becomes clear that this breakfast is not the end of anything, but the beginning of something that will unfold further. There is a preparation happening there, silent, almost invisible. An internal adjustment, a reorganization of the soul, a foundation being rebuilt for future decisions. And understanding this completely changes how we read this text and, above all, how we perceive our own life processes. If all of this resonates with something you're experiencing right now, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is here that the hidden teaching of this episode begins to reveal itself more clearly. When Jesus prepares breakfast and sits with the disciples, he is not merely being kind or creating a pleasant moment. There is a silent order in Jesus' actions, a spiritual logic that challenges our immediate gratification mindset. Before speaking of mission, Jesus cares for the soul. Before pointing out direction, he restores the inner self. Before entrusting something great, he addresses what is broken inside. This detail is crucial because we often imagine that spiritual restoration happens first, and that emotions simply need to follow. But Jesus takes the opposite approach. He understands that a wounded heart distorts decisions, compromises choices, and weakens the journey. It's no use entrusting a mission to someone who is still trapped by guilt, fear, or a sense of failure. The kingdom of God doesn't advance on crushed souls. It begins by healing what has been wounded along the way. The conversation with Peter makes this even more evident. Before any public reaffirmation, before any renewed responsibility, there is a space for reconnection. Jesus doesn't expose Peter before others, doesn't aggressively remind him of his denial, doesn't embarrass him. He asks, he listens, he guides. Jesus knows the human heart deeply. He knows that Peter didn't just need to be forgiven. He needed to feel restored. There's a huge difference between knowing you've been forgiven and believing you're still trustworthy. This is a point of profound impact for our own transformation. How many people continue trying to fulfill callings, responsibilities, and expectations, while inside they still carry untreated wounds? How many decisions are made based on guilt and not clarity? Jesus shows us that emotional restoration is not a secondary detail of faith, but a central part of the spiritual process. Caring for the soul is not weakness, it is fundamental. The hidden teaching here is that mission without restoration generates burden, not purpose. Jesus doesn't give tasks like someone distributing obligations. He rebuilds people. He reorganizes mindsets before repositioning destiny. This reveals a truth that often goes unnoticed. God is more interested in who we become than just in what we do. The spiritual journey is not just about fulfilling something external, but about allowing something internal to be transformed. When Jesus restores the disciples before sending them out again, he is showing that the kingdom of God begins from the inside out. It begins in the soul, in the emotions, in how a person sees themselves after a fall. It begins behind the scenes of the heart, where no one sees, but where everything is decided. This prior care is what sustains the mission in the long term. Without it, any calling becomes a burden, any responsibility becomes a demand. This principle also changes how we understand spiritual success. Moving forward doesn't always mean rushing. Sometimes moving forward means stopping, sitting at the table, and allowing Jesus to touch areas we avoid facing. There's a quiet maturity in this process, a wisdom that doesn't seek shortcuts. Jesus is not in a hurry because he knows that what is rushed doesn't last. He works with depth, not just with momentary impact. This restoration before the mission also reveals something powerful about God's patience with our processes. He doesn't discard people for failures, nor does he redefine identity because of mistakes. Jesus looks beyond the moment of the fall and sees the complete trajectory. He knows the layers of the heart, the mixed intentions, the hidden fears. Therefore, he acts with precision, touching exactly where it is needed, in just the right measure. Perhaps that's why this moment is so transformative. It confronts us with the idea that we don't need to be ready to sit at the table with Jesus. We only need to be available. Care comes before demands. Restoration comes before sending. And this completely changes the religious logic based on performance. The kingdom of God is not built on perfection, but on healing. This is the same Jesus who once walked ahead of his disciples toward suffering. As this understanding deepens, we begin to realize that breakfast was not an isolated detail, but the perfect setting for something greater to happen afterward. Something was being prepared there, not just in the fire or the food, but within each disciple. An emotional foundation was being restored to support future decisions, greater responsibilities, and an impact that would reveal itself over time. Nothing was rushed, nothing was forced. Everything followed the rhythm of restoration. If this idea resonates with something you're experiencing right now, comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because everything we've seen so far reveals not only something about that specific moment in history, but points directly to who Jesus is and, inevitably, to who we are within this journey. The same Jesus who prepared breakfast for the disciples wasn't stuck in that time. He continues to act with the same logic, the same sensitivity, and the same intention today. The difference is that, often, we change our expectations about how he should appear. There is a natural tendency to seek God only in grand events, in immediate answers, in visible miracles, and in spectacular turnarounds. Our mentality often associates divine presence with the extraordinary. But Jesus insists on revealing himself in the ordinary. He draws near in small gestures, in the details of routine, in the behind-the-scenes aspects of life that no one applauds. And this says a lot about the hidden truth of the kingdom of God. A kingdom that grows silently, that transforms from the inside out, and that does not depend on spotlights to generate real impact. When Jesus chooses to cook instead of preaching, he is teaching us something that transcends generations. God works while life unfolds. In the midst of routine, simple decisions, and seemingly unproductive waiting. How often do we think God is distant simply because nothing extraordinary is happening? How often do we interpret silence as absence when, in fact, he is closer than we imagine? Jesus remains present even when there are no grand signs, because he is not only interested in impressing, but in walking alongside us. This confronts us in a profound way, because perhaps the problem isn't the absence of God, but our difficulty in recognizing him in simple things. Perhaps we are expecting a grand answer while Jesus is offering us everyday care. Perhaps we are asking for guidance in big decisions, while he is teaching us to be faithful in small choices. There is a silent transformation happening when we learn to perceive God in the routine, and this change in perception completely alters our spiritual journey. This episode also reveals something delicate about ourselves. Often, we ignore simple encounters with Jesus because they don't fit the expectations we create. We want something quick, clear, immediate. But Jesus works within the time frame of maturation, not haste. He respects processes, understands limits, and acts with patience. And this requires a change of mindset from us. Following Jesus is not just about living great spiritual experiences, but learning to discern his presence in silence, in waiting, and even in the repetition of daily life. There is a profound impact when we begin to understand this. Faith ceases to be merely a resource for extreme moments and becomes a constant companion. Spirituality is no longer restricted to specific places and begins to inhabit ordinary life. Decisions are made with more awareness because we realize that God is also interested in the journey, not just the destination. Jesus continues to reveal himself, but now in a way that demands attention, sensitivity, and a willingness to see beyond the obvious. Perhaps that's why so many people feel spiritually weary, not because God is distant, but because they are looking in the wrong place. They are expecting the extraordinary and ignoring the everyday. They are seeking grand revelations while overlooking Jesus' small invitations. And these invitations almost always come in simple ways. A pause, a gesture of care, a moment of reflection, a silent presence that sustains more than 1,000 words. When we look honestly at this seaside breakfast, we realize it reflects much of our own history. Life goes on, responsibilities continue, wounds still exist, but Jesus remains there, present, attentive, caring. He doesn't change his way of acting according to the situation. He is the same in public miracles and in invisible moments. And recognizing this changes everything. It changes how we deal with waiting, with frustrations, and even how we evaluate our own faith. This understanding invites us on a deeper, less anxious, and more genuine journey. A journey where spirituality is not disconnected from reality, but integrated with it. Where God is not only sought in grand signs, but recognized in small encounters. Where transformation happens gradually, behind the scenes of the heart, while life unfolds outside. If this reflection resonates with you and makes you rethink how you've perceived God's presence in your daily life, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this seemingly simple moment not only moves us, it completely redefines how we live our faith. When we observe the resurrected Jesus preparing breakfast, something changes within us. Spirituality ceases to be an isolated event, an occasional emotional peak, and becomes a continuous, daily experience built in the details. This episode dismantles the idea that faith only happens when something extraordinary occurs. It reveals a hidden truth that we often ignore. God is deeply involved in ordinary life. For a long time, many people have learned that living the faith means seeking grand manifestations, quick answers, and intense experiences. But Jesus, once again, chooses a different path. He shows that true spirituality is not an escape from reality, but a presence within it. It is not about living in anticipation of the next great sign, but about recognizing God in the present moment. In the broken bread, the roasted fish, the shared silence. This kind of faith does not depend on perfect scenarios, but on an attentive heart. When we understand this, our mindset begins to change. The relationship with God ceases to be based solely on requests and becomes built on communion. Prayer is no longer just a moment of urgency, but a constant dialogue. The spiritual journey becomes more honest, less performative, and much more transformative. Because when God enters our routine, He transforms everything from the inside out: decisions, priorities, perceptions, and even the way we deal with our frustrations. This breakfast by the sea carries a profound impact precisely because it confronts us with a silent question. What kind of faith are we living? A faith that only recognizes God in grand services, in grand answers, in grand turning points? Or a faith that learns to perceive Jesus walking beside us as life unfolds? Jesus wasn't just feeding weary bodies. He was teaching that practical love sustains faith when emotion fades. There is something liberating in this revelation, because it removes the burden of having to feel something extraordinary all the time to believe that God is present. It allows us to rest. It allows us to experience spirituality in a more human, more real way. Faith becomes less about proving something and more about living something, less about appearances and more about relationships. And this completely changes how we face the challenges of everyday life. When Jesus cooks, He teaches us that caring is also spiritual, that being present is a sacred act, that loving in a practical way is one of the deepest expressions of the kingdom of God. This changes how we look at our own routine: work, home, relationships, pauses, silences. Everything can become a space for encountering God, not because everything is perfect, but because He is there. Perhaps this is the greatest invitation of this forgotten moment: to stop separating the spiritual from the everyday, to stop thinking that God only speaks in specific environments. The resurrected Jesus didn't wait for the disciples to go to the temple. He went to the beach, to the ordinary place, to where they were simply trying to survive emotionally. This reveals a God who draws near, who understands processes, and who respects everyone's timing. And when that realization hits, something inside us reorganizes itself. Faith ceases to be a demand and becomes a support. Spirituality stops being burdensome and becomes a space of care. The journey with God becomes more genuine because it happens at the rhythm of real life. This moment, so simple and so profound, has the power to completely transform how we see our relationship with God today, not as something distant, but as a constant, accessible, and deeply loving presence. And it is precisely from this shift in perspective that other layers of this encounter begin to reveal themselves, showing that nothing there was by chance and that there are still details of this moment that need to be observed more closely. If this is already starting to reorganize your way of seeing faith, comment below, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this moment by the sea spoke to you in some way. Perhaps it touched a memory, perhaps it brought a new perspective, perhaps it simply calmed your heart for a few minutes. And that says a lot. Content like this exists precisely to create this space for reflection, for pause, for encounter, and that's why it's worth continuing this journey together. If this type of message resonates with you, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to not miss future conversations and to keep alive this place where faith, real life, and depth meet. If you want, leave a comment so I know you stayed until the end. You can write something like, This message was for me, or I'm with you until the end. Reading this creates a real connection and shows that this journey is not lonely. And if, at any point in the video, you felt that something clicked inside, that an idea became clearer, or that a truth gained new meaning, leave a like. This helps the content reach more people who also need this simple and profound message. He who walked forward in pain is the same one who serves in silence after victory. There's a video over here that complements everything we've discussed today. Click on it and continue reading with me there.